Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Today we're talking about Pennsylvania's energy grid. But first, we're joined by Stephen Caruso, reporter from Spotlight, PA. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
With the election behind us, you filed a story about how 4 undecided voters eventually made their choices for president. How was this group selected?
Well, so it was really fun. Before the election, Spotlight did a story where we managed to, with the help of Franklin and Marshall polling, kind of gather a bunch of people who were undecided or just in general seemed like they had interesting perspectives on the election. I mean, I think we were looking for people who split their ticket, people who are independents or registered with a third party, people who might be newly registered to vote. Folks who just aren't sort of traditional voters. And we tried to then talk to them and go to them and be like, how are you processing this election? So when we did that, we found a few undecided voters. We found other people who fit that, who were decided. I talked to a new voter from who just moved to Pennsylvania, for instance, about how he was voting and whatnot, young voters. But this to say, so we went back to that group and found the people who were truly undecided, and we talked to 4 of them, and we took the results of those conversations and put it up on the website, myself and my colleagues. So it's always fun to kind of circle back.
So, Stephen, let's talk about these 4 undecided voters, and we'll start with Nicole Banta of Chester County. Who did she vote for and why?
So she, and this will be a trend that your viewers will know, is she voted for Trump. Basically, I think in the lead up, she was undecided, but she said that, for instance, she felt like Harris was kind of out of touch. She didn't like her campaign. One thing she specifically highlighted to my colleague Kate Huangpu, who did this interview, was that she didn't like that the Harris campaign kind of used a lot of celebrities to try to make her closing pitch. She thought that was kind of like tone deaf, and that was actually something Harris. She basically ended her general election campaign in Philadelphia, right outside the art museum, with a star-studded lineup of folks, artists coming and performing. So, and she said she just didn't like the tone of that. And I would say celebrity endorsements and use in elections isn't personally new. I mean, Obama has done this. How many times does Bruce Springsteen go out to rallies? But, for her, she just thought it didn't match the tone of people's lives. And so she ended up voting for Trump. And she didn't have a lot of reservations about that.
Now, I read your story, and I understand Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, made a difference for this voter. Why was that?
Well, Vance, I think, made a difference for her and a lot of other folks. Another vote we're going to get to, Ilya Pribishchik, who I talked to from Erie. Some other folks, I think they like that he's a new generation of leadership. I think they find him young, intelligent, well-spoken. And for some folks, I think that was a big deal. Both the Trump and Biden, who did not end up running for re-election, we're on the older side, 70, 80 years old. And I think that, seeing a fresh face like J.D. Vance made a lot of people feel like, just that there is going to be a handoff in leadership.
So let's talk about another voter, and you just mentioned the name a minute ago, Ilya Pribishchik from Erie County, and this voter didn't like Harris's refusal to go on Joe Rogan's podcast. Why is that important anyway, Stephen?
Well, Joe Rogan himself is obviously a very influential man in the media these days with his podcast that has, millions and millions of listeners. But for Pribishchik, he's a construction manager from Erie, and he said, look, I do job interviews all the time. I have to talk to people all the time. My job is talking to clients, talking to new employees, and trying to make sure that everyone's willing to have a talk about what we need to get done. And the fact that in his mind, Harris wasn't willing to go and talk to Joe Rogan for an unscripted conversation made him feel like she wasn't qualified for the job. He also said, this again in the article, but he told me that he really saw Rogan as sort of more left-wing, more democratic. Rogan in the past has said that he's been vaguely supportive of Bernie Sanders, the 2016 and 2020 presidential candidate from Vermont, more progressive. So for him, the fact that Harris wasn't willing to go and just talk to him for 3 hours struck him as why, if you can't have a conversation like that, how can I trust you with the keys to our government?
Stephen, let's talk about another voter. This one is Mohammed Qureshi from Philadelphia, and he had planned to vote for Trump, but he changed his mind when he heard Trump talk about the war in Gaza.
Yeah, and I think that this is interesting because I think these are sort of voters that Harris really wanted. And Qureshi is actually the only voter who we went back to who ended up voting for Harris. Everyone ended up voting for Trump, who was undecided. Because Trump made a big deal in states like Michigan, for instance, of trying to go get voters who wanted peace to vote for him. Qureshi went with Harris. I think also for him, he was concerned that Trump sounded racist. He's an immigrant from Pakistan. So I think, for him, it was just this concern of like, is Trump going to be best representative of me? She also thought Harris would be a new generation of leadership. She is she's younger than Trump or Biden. She's a biracial woman. I think he had this hope that like she could just bring in a new generation and be more accountable because she has to run for re-election. Trump will be term limited by the Constitution. He's made comments that indicate maybe he's thinking of something else. But, in the bare minimum, with Harris having to face voters potentially in 4 years if she had won, I think that also Qureshi valued that.
And let's talk about voter Salami Veseli from Lehigh County. That's the last of the 4 voters that Spotlight PA followed up with after the election. He immigrated from Albania. He voted for Trump. What was the reason he gave?
Well, I think his big thing is he's just concerned about the Department of Justice being used to prosecute political enemies. I think he's concerned about, he also looked at Democrats' attempts to build a coalition using former Vice President Dick Cheney as desperation. So I think for him, he also self-described himself, he's a registered independent, but is more conservative than Trump, as quite conservative. So I think for him, it was it made sense. He also brought up concerns about the border and public safety. This was a common theme I encountered both with the undecided voters we talked to and on election day when I was talking to voters. Trump voters seem to be really concerned that the southern border, that lots of immigrants, undocumented immigrants were coming up, and they always seem to have some public safety concerns related to that. So for him, especially as someone who I think is more conservative and who was concerned about this idea that the Democrats might go after freedom of speech, Trump was the natural choice.
Last question, Stephen. We have about 30 seconds left. Of this group we've discussed today, which did you find the most interesting or even surprising?
Look, I guess I got to go with Ilya Pribishchik. He's the person I talked to, and I'll say, like, we had a lovely conversation for about a half hour. And I thought, the thing he said is that, it wasn't just that Harris wouldn't do Rogan. It was also the answer he gave on when Harris said that there's nothing she would change from Biden's term. I just thought I could tell he really was trying to think about things. And he concluded our interview basically saying, look, Trump now has a trifecta. He better do something because if he comes back in 2026 and Republicans haven't, then, what are you going to do? Like, they have no excuses. So I'm interested to almost go back to him in 2 years.
Thank you very much. Stephen Caruso from Spotlight, PA.
Thanks.
The PCN Capitol Preview after a short break.
Can't get enough of the Pennsylvania Farm Show? PCN has what you need. With PCN Select, you can relive the excitement of events, find free and exclusive content, or catch something you missed while you were there. With PCN Select, the Pennsylvania Farm Show never ends. Go to PCNTV.com to learn more. PCN is everything Pennsylvania. The year 2026 will mark the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. As Pennsylvanians, we celebrate our nation's birth and the significant role our state has played in our country's history. Watch PCN Tuesday nights at 8 to see programs honoring our Commonwealth's rich heritage. PCN, celebrating America's 250th in Pennsylvania.
Welcome back. Our guests are Terry Fitzpatrick, President and CEO of the PA Energy Association, and Rob Altenburg, Senior Director for Energy and Climate at PennFuture. Welcome to our program, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Rob, where does Pennsylvania rank in the U.S. as a producer of energy?
So, in electricity production, we're number 2 overall, but in our area, we are the largest exporter of electricity in the country. So where Texas may produce more than we do, we send more to other states.
And what forms of energy are we sending out?
Certainly a lot of electricity. We certainly will also send out methane gas and other fuels.
Yes, yeah, Pennsylvania has a rich tradition as an energy producer going back to the first oil well. And then, of course, bituminous and anthracite coal, more recently natural gas. We're also one of the largest producers of nuclear energy in the country as well. And we have renewables too. And
we'll get into nuclear power, certainly. But first, let's talk about natural gas. And Terry, like you said, that's a relatively recent breakthrough here in Pennsylvania. And let's do a quick review on the technology that allows us to bring natural gas to the surface, because we didn't always have that.
Well, basically, you had, in the past, you had conventional oil wells, gas wells, that basically you drilled straight down to get the gas. Now, hydraulic fracturing that has allowed that technology where you drill down and then kind of you can draw gas from a wide area by breaking up the shale with water and then extracting the gas. That technological breakthrough about 20 years ago, I guess it was, it started to really be implemented, has really enabled Pennsylvania to leapfrog a lot of other states to the point where we're the #2 natural gas producer behind only Texas in the U.S.
So, Terry, you just talked about this latest technology going back only 20 years, but I'm going to take you back further back in time, like millennia. Where'd all this natural gas come from anyway?
Well, basically, it's just fossil fuels, plants that were buried in the earth. They captured the power of the sun, buried in the earth, concentrated, and now you're extracting these fuels, whether it be oil, natural gas, coal, in order to produce energy for our society.
And some energy people call Pennsylvania the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. So it was just luck. What were the circumstances that gave Pennsylvania such an abundance of this stuff, Terry?
It's just the geology of the state. The biggest gas play here is the Marcellus Shale. That extends, it kind of follows the mountain ranges. If you look at the Appalachian Mountains, it tends to follow those mountains. So
goes past our northern border, right?
It goes past our northern border. There is some in Maryland, West Virginia, some in Ohio, eastern Ohio, but it tends to follow those mountain ranges. And of course, we're developing that gas. Now, New York has said that they don't want to, that they've outlawed hydraulic fracturing, so they're not producing gas there in New York.
About how many homes in Pennsylvania are using natural gas? Just roughly. I'm just trying to get a handle on how popular this form of energy is.
I think
we have an abundance of it.
I think it's in the 20% range that's using natural gas as fuel.
As far as heating, though, goes, it's about
heating.
From residential customers, it's about half of the state uses natural gas to heat. It tends to be concentrated in more developed areas where it makes sense to have the infrastructure because it's expensive to put all those gas lines out there. So rural areas will tend not to have gas service as much, but the cities, all the major cities will have natural gas service.
So now that you mentioned infrastructure, Terry, we had to come up with a way to get the gas to market, and that's with pipelines, right? And how much development has taken place in recent years? You said the technology to bring the natural gas out goes back 20 years, but we got to keep up with getting it to market, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And there has been some development of that gas infrastructure. The industry, and I don't represent gas producers, but I think they would tell you that we don't have enough, in their view, infrastructure to get the gas out of the state, and it's kind of bottled up here to some extent. Of course, this gets very controversial. Citing any major infrastructure is difficult. And then you have the concern about the environment. Some folks don't think that we ought to be producing, any kind of fossil fuels. So it's difficult to get things like that built.
Did you say a few minutes ago that fracking was outlawed someplace else?
New York does not allow it.
Yeah, when did they start that policy, I wonder? And there are environmental concerns here in Pennsylvania that continue to this day.
I think it's probably about 10 years ago or so that I think it was then Governor Cuomo studied it for a couple of years and then decided that they did not want to allow it.
So let's talk about nuclear power and just how substantial of a source is that here in Pennsylvania. Rob, can you tell us?
Yeah, well, we have 4 operating nuclear power plants in the state, possibly a 5th one with the reactivation of 3 Mile Island. It produces roughly a third of our electricity for the state.
And efficiency-wise, what goes into the production of energy there, and why does it continue to be a profitable way to produce energy?
Well, nuclear plants in general, when you're talking about an already built, fully depreciated nuclear plant, that's one of the cheapest forms of energy you have because you don't have...
The plants are already here. The infrastructure's here.
And the fuel costs are fairly set. Now, we did have an issue with 3 Mile Island. Of course, it was losing many millions of dollars every year, and that's why that plant went offline. Part of that is that plant has a single reactor. Since obviously 1979.
One functioning reactor.
Yeah, where the other plants have had 2 reactors. So they had all the costs, but basically half the revenue.
So 3 Mile Island has been closed for a couple of years, and now there's talk about turning it back on because they appear to have a customer.
Yes.
Terry, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's been, over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, there's been a big change in the outlook for electricity demand. And it comes about because of artificial intelligence and the data centers that are necessary to power it. Also, more generally, to electrification of things, such as the proliferation of electric vehicles, which need to be charged. That's really changed the outlook. TMI closed in 2019 because of the economic concerns that Rob mentioned. But boy, the outlook has changed very quickly. And the owners of TMI signed a contract with Microsoft to take all the output of the plant if they can get TMI restarted. So Constellation Energy, which owns the plant, has started the process to get all the necessary permits from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to restart it. I think it's a few years until they think they'll get through all of that.
Is it unusual to have just one customer is what it amounts to? Microsoft is interested in the power. Is that unusual? And certainly all your eggs are in one basket, too, when you turn that reactor back on.
I mean, it's certainly unusual to have contracts that large. For power purchase agreements. The agreements themselves aren't that unusual. And the power, of course, the power that Microsoft is going to be getting in their facility in Virginia, it's not necessarily, those electrons aren't necessarily coming from 3 Mile Island. So it's 3 Mile Island is putting power off the grid, onto the grid, and then Microsoft is off taking the power someplace else. So they're not relying on TMI actually running on any given day to be able to take power.
Terry, you mentioned a few minutes ago power being necessary for artificial intelligence. And try to give us some insight as to why that requires more power. I still just barely have a hold on artificial intelligence itself, let alone how we power it.
Yeah, and I'm not the wonk to explain it in great detail. It's
You'll
just
be on my level, perhaps.
I know there's big warehouses with computers in that have to run.
Are those data centers? I got to get used to that too, because I'm hearing a lot about that since this proposal about TMI came out.
Right. Yes. Yes, those are the computers, the data centers that power the artificial intelligence, that run all those computers so it can generate the artificial intelligence, yes.
And before we put the cart before the horse, we have to consider that TMI isn't necessarily going to open. There are certain hurdles that have to be cleared. Maybe the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, what has to happen next?
Well, they have to go through. They're planning on going through a relicensing procedure to extend their license. They certainly have to go through regulatory procedures. The fuel rods aren't in the reactor anymore. They were taken out in 2019. So they're going to have to go through the whole refueling cycle there. And there's certainly going to be potential updates that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would require. Certainly, they have to make sure they're meeting current safety standards, and there may be additional environmental permitting that they'll need.
And there is still some local opposition, too. In fact, I think some of the folks that were involved when the accident occurred, and that didn't want to restart.
Are still there in Middletown, perhaps?
They're still there. They still bear the, psychological scars, I guess, of the accident, and they're going to be participating and probably trying to stop it if they can.
So, as Rob pointed out, we have 4 nuclear plants in Pennsylvania. Are we permitted to build any more nuclear plants? Is there a moratorium there? I need a refresher.
There's no moratorium on building them. The last plant that was proposed was the PPL's Bell Bend plant, and they withdrew that permit application in, I believe, 2017. At that point, they said it would cost $15 billion to build the plant, and I believe there were financing difficulties.
Yeah, there have not been any major nuclear plants built probably for decades until in Georgia, the Vogtle plant that Southern Company built. The problem with building nuclear plants is they are very, very expensive to build, and they've been plagued by a history of cost overruns when you attempt to build them. Now, once you build them, they can run them great, 24/7
expensive
power,
on the front end,
but very expensive on the front end, and it's been difficult to get past that, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania, which relies on electricity markets to build things.
And I'll add that all the plants that we have, they were all built in a regime where we had regulated utilities in the state that were effectively guaranteed that they would make a profit. The ratepayers would pay for the plant and they would make a profit. Now, if you build a new plant, it has to compete in the open market to sell its power, and it's a much different proposition to attract billions and billions of dollars in investment in that situation.
Before we go any farther, gentlemen, let's talk about something called PJM. It's important our viewers just have a basic understanding of that. PA gets its energy from something called the PJM. So what does that stand for? What is it? Who cares to explain that? Go ahead, Rob.
Well, PJM, it stood for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, which was originally what it started at. Now it's our power grid. It extends all or part of 13 states in the District of Columbia. It serves 60 million people. It extends from about North Carolina to Chicago. So it is now an incredibly large, what they call a regional transmission organization.
Why do we need this big clearinghouse for power?
Well, having the ability to draw from a larger grid gives us a lot of flexibility. You saw in comparison, Texas ran into a lot of problems because the Texas grid doesn't really extend outside of Texas. And they don't have the ability to wheel power the way we do. So because if we have sunshine or wind in North Carolina, we can have solar and wind producing power. If we don't, we have Pennsylvania resources. We can move power where we need it.
So the PJM is made up of, I understand, 13 states, including Pennsylvania, and I think the District of Columbia, too. So how long has that system been in existence? Again, I'm sure some of our viewers are maybe hearing about this for the first time today. How long has this been in place and taking care of our energy needs?
You know, it really goes back, its roots go back, I think, to the maybe 1960s or 70s. It started out really just as a way for utilities to trade power between themselves. As Rob said, back before electric restructuring in the 1990s, electric utilities basically did everything as far as getting the electricity produced and transported, to your home or business. And it started out just being the utilities trading back and forth. But with electricity competition and change in the structure of the industry, PJM took on new roles where it would dispatch plants over that wider area to get the efficiencies that Rob talks about, and also operate wholesale markets in which buyers and sellers could really create a more efficient industry. That was the goal.
So one more basic question about PJM. What's the relationship between PJM and the utilities? It sounds like the utilities buy the power from PJM. Is that right?
Yes. If you're within PJM, just very broadly, there are markets. The folks that sell power in those markets are the generators of electricity. Those are no longer considered utilities in Pennsylvania. The folks that buy power in PJM markets are utilities, but also competitive power providers, because in Pennsylvania, for example, you don't have to buy the electricity itself from your utility. You can buy from a competitive provider. But utilities will sell the electricity to you. It's called default service if you don't choose a competitive provider. So utilities and those competitive retail suppliers are the buyers in that market.
Now, I'm guessing the demand for electricity, and we've already touched on this somewhat, has changed a lot in the last 15 years or so. And Terry, you told us about artificial intelligence and the data centers required to make that happen. But we have to think of our everyday mundane gadgets. I mean, certainly everybody has a smartphone. That's how it is. They have a whole bunch of other gadgets. And now we're recharging cars, too. So just how much has the demand for electricity changed in, say, like the last 15 years, can you say?
For a long time, it was really flat. I mean, for going back, I don't know if it's 20 years or so, the demand for electricity has grown just very slowly. Really,
which is probably good, right?
Well, yes, there's a lot of good things about that, and that's even as we're adding a lot of the gadgets that you're talking about, because the industry just got more efficient in a lot of ways. From the end user standpoint, from the energy producer standpoint, there were a lot of efficiencies that led to that. But more recently, we're seeing that start to change now as a result of things like the biggest drivers are the data centers for artificial intelligence, charging electric vehicles. And there's also been an environmental movement, a push to get things away from coal and natural gas to using more electricity. That's part of the trend as well.
And on the subject of gadgets, briefly, if I can just briefly make this about my own experience at home, my lights dim when I turn on the printer. So what's the message being sent there? That there's not enough power coming to my house? And the printer strikes me as a small gadget anyway. Maybe you fellas don't even know what I'm talking about.
I think you'd have to talk to an electrician there. I'm not sure I want to take a shot.
Maybe it's a local problem and it's not a reflection on the grid. It might be a problem in my house.
My grandfather was a lineman for an electric utility, but his grandson doesn't know much about that.
The reliability of the electric grid is debated often. So what are the concerns, Rob?
Well, certainly we're heavily reliant on electricity for just heating, certainly air conditioning in the summer, and just our business operation and the daily life, of course. But the grid itself, now the actual structure of the grid is very flexible and capable of delivering power, but the energy sources, we have started to see some constraints. Early on, we thought of the peak summertime load as being the big problem when everybody turns on their air conditioning. What we saw in Winter Storm Elliott, which is Christmas, I guess, the year before last, was that winter load that became a problem. And during that winter storm, more than 40% of the grid's resources were offline. They were in forced outage. They couldn't run. And 70% of the outages were gas plants. So we had been traditionally relying on these fossil fuel plants, thinking they were reliable, and we learned that they were not.
Yeah, there's work that needs to be done there because the electricity system, as Rob said, when you're relying on gas, it's only going to be as reliable as the gas system. So there's some work that needs to be done. I think there has been some work done to try to winterize those facilities. But when it comes to reliability, I would point out PJM issued a report last year called Energy Transition in PJM, Reliability, Resource Reliability, and Risks. And one of the things they said there was they raised the concern. They said, we have enough electricity to meet demand now, but if they looked 5 years down the road, there's concern. We're prematurely retiring plants that can operate around the clock. And right now, almost everything that's being proposed to be built is either renewable energy or storage. And that is not getting actually built at a very fast rate. Of the number of projects that have applied, only 5% of those renewable projects are getting built. So PJM looked at those trend lines and said, we want to raise the concern now that we're afraid we're not going to have enough power in 5 years.
Terry, go back to those plants you mentioned a minute ago that are being retired. So why are they being retired, as you said, prematurely?
The biggest reason is what PJM calls policy factors. It's state and federal environmental rules that in some cases, such as there's a law in Illinois, which is part of Illinois is part of PJM, but they passed a law saying that they're going to close all their coal and their natural gas plants by different dates, I think starting in 2030. You also have federal environmental rules that are leading to the closure of coal plants and even gas plants in some cases. So those plants are going offline, and we're really not adding the type of resources that at this point that are necessary to replace them.
Gentlemen, I'm going to give you a break just for a minute while we look at program notes for PCN. With holiday shopping about to go in high gear, scammers and frauds are out there trying to figure out ways to separate you from your money. Avoiding holiday scams is the topic with Mary Bach from the AARP of Pennsylvania and Deputy State Attorney General John Abel on the next Focus on Aging Adults tomorrow at 7 p.m. Right after that, the subject is natural gas production here in Pennsylvania. Dave Callahan from the Marcellus Shale Coalition brings us up to date when On the Issues features him tomorrow at 8 p.m. And right after that, On the Issues keeps the focus on energy with Andrew Tabler, president and co-founder of Drake Energy Security, and Hind Carnes, tourism director at the Clarion County Economic Development Corporation. They'll be here tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Journalist Roundtable returns with Kate Huang-Pu from Spotlight PA, Rachel McDevitt from WITF, and Taylor Millard from the Delaware Valley Journal. They'll have the latest news from the Capitol Thursday at 7 p.m. It's time for the PIAA Cross Country Championships on PCN. Our coverage of the different classes of girls and boys begins with the Single A girls at 7 p.m. on Friday and goes on all evening long. For more schedule information on PIAA Cross Country coverage, go to PCNTV.com. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free of charge on the internet. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is Everything Pennsylvania. We're a 501c3 nonprofit television network that relies on viewers and donors like you. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now we're talking about energy here in Pennsylvania with our guests. And we were talking about the reliability of the grid and the different forms of energy, and just how much, maybe this plays off of what you were saying a few minutes ago, Terry, how much pressure is there here in Pennsylvania to close fossil fuel plants due to environmental concerns?
Well, we see most of the plants we see closing aren't for environmental issues. The average age of a major coal plant when it closes is about 40 to 50 years, and the plants we have are really all in that age range. Mm-hmm. So they are older plants. Also, probably the biggest factor has been when we had the glut of methane gas being produced from fracking, the prices went down. It became much cheaper to operate gas plants. Gas plants use fewer employees. They're so certainly less expensive and intensive to run. And that just drove the electricity prices down to the point that these coal plants were not profitable. So we when you're talking 10, 15 years ago, 90% of the energy or more in Pennsylvania came from either coal or nuclear. Now we've almost flipped that, where we've got 53% of our energy is coming from gas, which was in single-digit percents before that, and nuclear is remained very close. So, you know, we always hear that it's the environmental issues that's closing these plants, but really it's the economic issue. The coal plants haven't been competing with the gas plants.
At what rate are we exporting natural gas from Pennsylvania anyway? I understand it can go out in liquid forms, and that's got to offer some flexibility, right?
There's certainly projects to send natural gas outside of the state, and this is one of the concerns. We had the glut of gas that lowered energy prices in Pennsylvania, and we have subsidized the production of gas in a lot of ways throughout the state. But now there's more pressure to subsidize consumption of gas. Some of that is building new facilities in state, but some of it are things like LNG facilities to send gas out of state. The
LNG, liquefied natural gas.
Yes. And the gas industry wants that because they want the prices to be higher. So when we see exporting natural gas, what that means is higher costs for Pennsylvania consumers.
Well, you know, I guess I would say the development of the Marcellus Shale has been the biggest, I think, economic and energy development for Pennsylvania in the time in my 40-year career. I would say that. And Rob's right. I mean, those low gas prices, they did put economic pressure on the coal plants. They actually put pressure. That's why TMI closed, because TMI couldn't compete with those low gas prices in the wholesale markets. And we did build a lot of gas plants over the past, I would say, 15 years or so. However, there are almost no gas plants proposed to be built now because of the economic pressures. And because part of it, I have to say, is because of the war on fossil fuels. A couple of years ago, I heard President Biden say, we're going to need fossil fuels for a few more years. And I remember thinking, boy, if you're a developer of a natural gas plant, and I personally believe we're going to need more natural gas plants if we're going to keep up with demand. But if you're a developer of that, you have to get your money back over a few decades, not over a few years. So I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about where we're going. Of course, now we've had the election, and now President Trump is going to be returning. So really our policy environment has flipped back and forth, making it hard to invest.
What will this new president mean to these proposals that President Biden outlined?
Well, I mean, certainly we're going to see rollbacks in regulations and environmental protections in the fossil fuel industry. But what we saw in the last Trump term, I mean, more fossil fuel plants announced their closure during 4 years of the Trump administration than the prior 8 years of the Obama administration. So even though you have you certainly have a regulatory regime that's going to be more lax enforcement and less environmental and public health protections, it's not necessarily going to change these investment decisions to build more plants. The question is, can they compete or not? A new plant coming on the grid has to convince its financiers and its backers that it is going to be able to operate profitably for years and years and years. Certainly, gas plants many are operating profitably now, but in many places it's cheaper to build new solar and wind facilities than it is to run existing natural gas. I mean, solar is the cheapest form of energy we have on our grid. So right now we have 56% of our generation is gas, 0.5% is solar. We certainly have that room to take up a lot of the growth in demand from renewable resources.
And we're going to talk more about solar and other renewable sources in a minute. But first, let's consider Joe Biden's goal to eliminate all carbon emissions by 2035. Now with a new face in the White House, I wonder what becomes of that goal, Terry.
Yeah, I guess I want to say, Rob and I agree on a lot of things. We probably have a disagreement on this one. There is certain analysis you can do that seems to indicate that solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuel type electric generation. However, if you look at the total system and what it takes to run a system, you need power 24/7 to operate that system. If I look at actual experience and I look at jurisdictions that have tried to push more renewables onto their grid, those places have higher costs than we do. If you look at California, if you look at New York, if you look at New Jersey, and of course the poster child is probably Germany. If you look at Germany, which is trying to push almost everything into renewables, residential customers there pay between 2 and 3 times what we do in Pennsylvania. So I don't think that those are models, and I don't think that generally trying to push more renewables is going to lead to lower cost electricity.
Maybe Germany will achieve some efficiency someday?
Well, it remains to be seen. But look what happened with them when the war in Ukraine broke out and they couldn't get natural gas from Russia. They had to quickly build a facility so they could take liquefied natural gas from us to keep things running. They've had to keep coal plants running because they're trying to shut down their nuclear industry. I could go on a lot about Germany's energy policy. They're trying to, they're well-intentioned, but I don't think they're going about things in a balanced way.
Let's consider then, as far as pocketbook issues are considered for consumption of energy in this country, what do you suppose could happen in the next couple years with Donald Trump being back in the White House? Is there good news or bad news for consumers of electricity?
Well, it looks like energy costs are going to be going up, really, no matter what happens in Washington. We saw this with our PJM, our grid operator. One of the big changes, they have a thing called the capacity market, where facilities bid to operate 3 years in advance to make commitments to be available. Those capacity prices went up tenfold over the summer. And that has not yet really impacted consumer rates, but it will. The independent market monitor for PJM says, well, they delayed their next capacity auction from December for another 6 months. And their market monitor has said that we might actually see those prices double again. And folks that are talking about it are saying it looks like we are just going into a regime of certainly higher capacity prices for energy. For electricity prices, and the big driver of that, by the way, was that Winter Storm Elliott. Effectively, natural gas facilities, the grid can't count on them as being as reliable as they thought they could. So they were purchasing more capacity. Other issues with the grid as well. So those costs are going up. We're certainly heavily reliant on fossil fuels. Fossil fuel prices do not look like they're going to be dropping anytime soon. So the problem is we need to diversify our energy mix. And certainly Terry mentioned that examples like Germany, we're not in that regime doing what Germany is intending did, and we're not going to follow the policy procedures that Germany did.
And it's very expensive at this stage anyway, right? That was your point, Terry?
Correct.
Go ahead. Sorry, Rob.
But right now, with this 0.5% of energy on a grid, PJM, the grid operator, recently had said we could have 90% of our grid carbon-free. They certainly have the capability of doing that. The reason why we need more clean renewable generation, certainly not only the public health and environmental benefits, but it is a method to diversify the grid and to help control the costs. Costs of solar panels have been consistently going down. Their efficiency is going up. Gas prices, fossil fuel prices, they're highly variable and likely to rise. Renewable prices are, if anything, likely to drop. That is where the future is going. We have to adjust our grid to deal with these variable loads, and no one's saying that gas is going away entirely anytime soon. But that's just the future we're going to be in.
So how popular or viable is the future of solar energy? I mean, I know I can look over at my neighbor's house and he has the solar panels telling the story by being mounted on the roof. Are there more panels being installed like that? Are they getting popular? Are the incentives out there? And most importantly, what's the impact on the bottom line of your bill if you have solar panels on your house?
There's a lot of incentives out there to develop solar, and there's no question you can save money if you put solar panels on your house, and that's the big selling point for them. Now, the point I would raise is, and I don't want to this gets kind of complicated, but there's something called net metering policy, where really I think the bottom line is that customers who install solar aren't paying their full share of the cost of the grid that they still rely on. And those costs are being shifted to the other non-solar customers. So that's a problem with that policy. California, which has a lot of rooftop solar, is trying to address that, but it gets very difficult once you put that regime in place to try to change it. But yeah, we can have more solar. But I think I would differ somewhat from Rob. I don't think you can run a modern economy, a full-time economy, on part-time power. I mean, you can clearly have some variable, intermittent types of energy as part of your mix, but I never think that's going to be the workhorse of your system as much as plants that can operate 24/7 to generate power when we need it.
How much is Pennsylvania's total energy portfolio renewable?
About 0.5%.
Half of 1%.
Well, excuse me, 0.5% solar. Renewable is about 8%.
Solar is wind thrown in there too? No. And what are the other renewables? Let's try to acknowledge them all.
With wind and low impact hydro, together it's all about 8% of our generation.
Yeah, it's a fairly small percent at this point. But again, if I look back to what's happening in PJM, if you look at it from that perspective, what's in their interconnection queue. Right now, 95% of it is solar and battery storage, maybe a little bit of wind. There's almost no natural gas in there. So if you look at where things are going, in part because of all the federal incentives that are out there, it seems to be pushing everything towards renewable. Again, we can have renewable as part of our mix, but 95% renewable is not really an all of the above energy strategy, and that's what we support at the Energy Association, trying to have a balance among all those things.
And what is the future? Go ahead, Rob, please.
Just to clarify, the PJM report, it didn't talk about 95% renewables. It talked about 90% carbon-free. So that includes the nuclear generation in there. So we're certainly interested in preserving the carbon-free nuclear generation on the grid. But the critical thing is not to get rid of gas. Gas had a role as peaking operations and grid stabilization for many, many years. The goal is to be not reliant on gas. And with more than 50% of our generation coming from a single energy source, that's just a lot of eggs in one basket that is proven to be not reliable when we need it.
Well, I think more than one thing can be true. I mean, I'm raising the concern that trying to rely too much on renewables is not going to lead to reliable and affordable power for folks. It is true that there are some issues with natural gas. It's not perfect, but there isn't a perfect form of energy out there. There are trade-offs with all of them. In some ways they need to improve. And again, I think the gas system really does need to take a look at making sure that they're winterized so that when we need it the most, that it's available.
Terry, before we run out of time, take a minute and tell us about your association.
Yes, I'm the president of the Energy Association of Pennsylvania. We're a trade group of electric and natural gas utilities operating in the Commonwealth. As I said, we've restructured energy markets in Pennsylvania, so our electric utility members don't own generation anymore. Mm-hmm. They own the wires, and they provide the bills to customers, and they'll also sell the energy supplies to customers if you don't buy from a competitive supplier.
Rob, what goes on at PennFuture?
Yeah, so we're a membership-based, nonprofit environmental advocacy organization. We have offices all across Pennsylvania. We certainly focus a lot on the energy transition to a clean energy economy, but we're also involved in a number of other environmental issues across the state.
We've been doing our program for about 40 minutes now, and I don't think once we've mentioned coal. So is coal a significant part of Pennsylvania's energy portfolio now? Right
now, it's below 10% of our generation and dropping.
Sounds significant, however.
Yeah, we have four major.
Hovering 10%?
Well, we have four major coal plants left in Pennsylvania. They have all announced closures by 2030. Either they're going to close, or in the case of like Brunner Island, convert to gas fire. Once that is gone, the only coal generation we'll have is the waste coal plants. By and large, those are very, very small plants, mostly in the 100 megawatt range, burning the vast piles of coal waste we see all around Pennsylvania.
And there was some environmental fallout from coal, right?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we've been relying on coal for well over 100 years, and it's the highest polluting source of energy we have in the state. Certainly, that's impacted our air quality. It's impacted our water quality. There's issues dealing with the coal ash and the coal combustion residuals from the plants. And it's something that we are going to be struggling with for many, many decades to come.
You mean the environmental fallout of this form of energy?
Of running
for
coal,
decades
yes.
to come.
Well, fossil fuels in general. I mean, we have the same issue with gas and abandoned gas wells.
When you look at any form of energy, I don't think you can just look at one thing. You need to look at affordability, reliability, and environmental sustainability. You need a balance among all those. Coal, it's true, it emits more carbon dioxide than natural gas. From the environmental standpoint, it has its downsides. It is reliable, though. I do think with the Trump administration now, you're probably going to see an effort to slow down that closure of all of those coal plants, particularly in light of the increased demand that I talked about and the impact of closing all of those plants. So I think that's something to stay tuned on.
Let's try to close our show on this note. We talked about the federal government. Of course, Donald Trump is coming back into the White House. Let's consider Governor Josh Shapiro. Are there any bills out there that you're keeping an eye on that are interesting and will have some impact on energy?
Yeah, well, there's a couple. He introduced an energy package back in the spring, and it consisted mostly of trying to promote more renewables for the grid and also to put in place what's called a cap and trade system on power plant carbon dioxide emissions, kind of similar to something called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that's been very controversial.
That got tangled up in court, didn't it?
It's still tangled up in court, the legality of it. So he proposed another type of plan, which I think is probably pretty similar to RGGI, although technically you're not in this group with these other northeastern states.
Now, ostensibly, it involves a goal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
That's the goal of it, yes. Now, that didn't go anywhere in the legislature because the Republicans in control of the Senate don't want it. I do think there's maybe some rethinking of that being done because of the attention that's being given to this PJM problem and closing plants. I think they're trying to see how those pieces fit together.
How about you, Rob? Is there anything you're watching in Harrisburg at the Capitol?
Yeah, well, certainly our organization is involved in the litigation around the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And the simple thing of right now, a fossil fuel power plant gets to pollute for free. They don't pay any fees for dumping their carbon in the air, and that's creating certainly economic as well as environmental problems. We're following that. This is the end of a session, so certainly we'll look to see what bills are going to be introduced in the next session. sessions, some of the things we'd like to see are a community solar bill, which would allow people that can't put solar on their roof to buy or lease a share of a centralized system. That's certainly a way for consumers to address their own electric bill, and I'm sure that's going to be debated in the next session.
Our guests have been Terry Fitzpatrick, President and CEO of the PA Energy Association, and Rob Altenburg, Senior Director for Energy and Climate at PennFuture. Thank you both. PCN's Phil Beckman talked to Angela Ferrito, President of the AFL-CIO of Pennsylvania.
Angela Ferrito is the president of the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO and president of Union Energy. How are jobs changing as the clean energy sector continues to develop?
Well, I think that the jobs may be changing, but the work in the workforce itself looks very similar to what it has been in the past. And we are at the forefront of the work to ensure that the clean energy jobs that are coming up through the pipe are, properly trained. The workforce is properly trained, and the jobs that are being created are creating good, family-sustaining, career-driven union jobs.
What efforts are you making to unionize in these new clean energy sectors?
Well, we are at the table in conversations everywhere these conversations are being had to drive home the importance of these jobs. We have a workforce training program set up in our apprenticeship programs with the building trades that already are equipped to be training these future workforces. And so though the technologies are different, the programs are in place to already support and engage these new workers of the future and to build around the new energy economy.
Are you finding that the unionization in the clean energy sector is matching that in the fossil fuel energy sector?
Well, I think it's anything. It's like anything, right? Unionization comes from a need, right? It comes from a group of workers deciding that this needs to have their voice at the table, right? These new jobs, they have to have a voice in it, and so we are finding that a lot of the jobs that are currently being created are, maybe not as quality standards around them, right? We're seeing a lot of like low road jobs being created that aren't family sustaining. They aren't driving careers into the future. And so we're working to ensure that as these new sectors are being lifted in this new energy economy, that workforce is at the forefront of everyone's mind. And so we're working to ensure that, the unionization of these jobs is just a natural creation, because the unions are already, we're ready to support the workforce of the future. And so that's what we're working to do, is to work with people to understand that we have the proper training, we have the proper, programming to bring in this new workforce, to lift it up and ensure that Pennsylvania stays a leader in this new energy economy.
How are businesses within the clean energy industry responding to your efforts?
We have businesses who are ready, willing, and excited to work with unions. They see the benefit to them to partner with unions and to work to really ensure that the people that are coming in are properly trained and ready to hit the ground running when they get there. And I think that there is a real collaboration that's happening between these businesses and the trade unions.
What kinds of things do unions do to help build political support for projects that involve clean energy jobs?
Well, we ensure that there's policies that are, being driven that help lay the groundwork to make a lot of this work possible in the state of Pennsylvania. We understand how, the correlation between policy and production. And so we work to ensure that those policies are being driven through the Congress and eventually get to the governor's desk to ensure that we are a state that invites and a state that people want to come do business in. And so that's what we do. We also are at tables with many groups to talk about the potential of what's to come and how we can all be integrated and work together to ensure that we continue to keep Pennsylvania that strong force that it's always been in the energy industry.
For workers in the fossil fuel industry who want to transition to the clean energy industry, what types of transition programs do unions offer?
Well, we oftentimes, people think of new energy sector being a different sort of training module or training, but a lot of the training that a lot of our sectors have gone through, it prepares them for what's to come. And so, we're working every day to ensure that our training programs are up to speed with the most modern technologies and are really wrapped around this new economy to ensure that people who are going through and getting going through apprenticeships and coming out as journeymen or we're working to ensure that these new technologies are becoming part of those training modules.
Angela Ferrito is the president of the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO and president of Union Energy. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Thank you to Phil Beckman for that interview. Before we go, a reminder about On the Issues. We'll have more about the subject of natural gas production in Pennsylvania with Dave Callahan from the Marcellus Shale Coalition. He'll be here tomorrow at 8 p.m. Then right after that, On the Issues keeps the focus on energy with Andrew Tabler, president and co-founder of Drake Energy Security, and Hind Carnes, tourism director at the Clarion County Economic Development Corporation. They'll be here tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.